Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
The first of two lectures I'm going to give you, and this first one is in a sense preliminary to the second one, but the second one is the more important one. The main topic I have is the problem for users of English as a foreign language of the patterns of variation of the forms of words that occur in English. Now, fortunately, about 99% of all English words can be looked at in the dictionary, and you can find a form given you in the dictionary in the phonetic style which you can use every time you use that word. But still leaves behind quite a number of words that must change if you're to speak English normally and in a natural sounding way. And in detail, I'll use those words. They are so important because although they're so few, they are a very large proportion of the words you actually use. They are 1 in 4, in fact. And that will be my topic next week, the weak forms and contractions that we use. But what I'm doing in this lecture is taking a general look at the way in words, the way in which words differ in their shapes, in their forms, how they change the set of phonemes they're built up out of. Now, fortunately, a good deal of this you can forget when I first said it to you. But if you do know it, you'll understand better what's happening to the important words that you must vary if you're going to sound really good in your English. So I've listed these 4 main types of change that occur to the shapes of words, the forms of words, and I've listed them in the first paragraph there under 4 headings. These headings are assimilation, elision, compression, and liaison. Now, you'll find that the main one that will be effective next week will be elision, but the others do occur too. And now I'm going to go through these particular forms and give you some examples of what happens to such words. You can see that I've told you which the 4 kinds are in the first paragraph. In the second paragraph of your handout, I've mentioned the fact that in the dictionary you find the dictionary form or the lexical form or the citational form. And in paragraph 3, I emphasize for you what I just said to you, that only a fraction of the reduced words need to be adopted by you. But that fraction in the number of words is very, very small. But in the frequency of their occurrence is very, very high. As I say, 1 in 4 words that you actually utter in conversation in English belong in this important category. Now, probably the least important for the EFL user is this first set I'm going to deal with in paragraph 4, and this is called assimilation. Old idea, people have been familiar with it for a long time, and what happens is that one word becomes adjacent to another and influences usually the end of one word influences the beginning of the next. And I'll give 1 or 2 examples here. But I say, for the most part, you don't need to worry about this. You will probably do it automatically of your own account without realizing you are doing it. But the examples I give here are warnings not to be too careful, in fact. The examples I give here are bus, now I'm going to say it artificially slowly, bus shelter, right? Now, actually, when speaking at a normal speed and incorporating the word bus shelter into an ordinary English sentence, there will be no time to say a proper S separately from the sh which follows it. So we don't say bus shelter. If we did, we'd have to hold on to that S artificially long. It would distort the rhythm of the sentence. It would sound as if we're saying something different from what we want to say. So we say bus shelter. And we might even take it as far as the second type of change. In fact, just having 1 esh. But what does happen very frequently is that the S at the end of bus becomes an esh to match up to the esh that begins the word shelter. And I'll give you another little example there. Is she, for instance, where it's the Z, the Z at the end of is becomes a corresponding critical sound in the same type as esh. It becomes, and so you get not is she, but is she, is she, and not even as slow as that. Is she. And as you can hear, perhaps even the sound may drop up as far as the head of the first word. So that's that type of thing. I've given another couple of examples there. A particular warning is not to slow down too much for these words. Horseshoe is one, and tortoise shell. Horseshoe and tortoise shell, the other examples I've given in that paragraph. And then I point out that there's a kind of subdivision of assimilation, which we call coalescence, where you can't say that the one thing becomes another, but the two things combine. And we've got examples of that in something like digit, where the D at the end of dig and the Y at the end of U combine to produce a completely different item in our set of consonant phonemes. That's the item J. So two phonemes have become one. So did you one example? And this sort of thing used to be frowned on by some people. You always find some people want to criticize others because they think they know better. People who do a lot of criticizing of other people's speech are usually wrong anyway. They do it from preconceived ideas that are wrong in themselves. But you will find, particularly past generations, people have frowned on saying Tuesday instead of Tuesday. Now, I'm old-fashioned. I do say Tuesday, not Tuesday. But when I hear Tuesday today, I'm not surprised at all to hear it from the best educated speakers. It's not at all an objectionable pronunciation as far as I'm concerned. Same, the other example I give there is due, pronounced as Jew, right? Due. In fact, due without any friction occurring before that of you is unusual. Even I say due, there's a certain bit of friction coming in, so we're already halfway from an ordinary D, as in do say, to the J affricate that you get in Jew. Right? So that's assimilation so far. Now, I have one or two further comments to make on assimilation before I leave this topic. And one of them is about certain expressions which, if you fail to make the assimilation, you won't sound right. So it sounds as if you're saying some different sentence. And the best example of this, the most important, very, very common expression is used to. Now, again, I said that very artificially because in any case, used to is not even the same thing as used to. Right? Used to is the most often heard version of the sequence. And what you can see what's happening, that in fact a double effect, two of our phenomena, one is the D at the end of the unit goes all together. The more important thing is that in used to, the Z of used, and I don't know whether you realize this, that there's a verb used in English and a noun, use, and they have a different final consonant. Use has a Z ending, use has a sharp S ending, and that's the noun. But in used to, that rule, it doesn't apply because it's a special case. Here, under the influence of the following T, the Z of the verb to use becomes converted into an S, so it doesn't, at that point, show any difference from the noun. The noun normally has use, and the noun should never have use with a Z in ordinary use. So, there we are. Then we have used to, which I would recommend you strongly to avoid saying in any other way than that. Used to, that's the proper way to say it. If you don't, then you sound as if you're saying something different. Because in fact, there are two different meanings to the sequence used and to. One way I could demonstrate it by a little sentence such as feathers used to be used to write with, right? Feathers, you know, a quill pen, a feather pen, Feathers used to be used to write with. Now, first times used to were accustomed to. That's the meaning when used to has normal form. 99 times out of 100, when we use the expression used to, we're talking about were accustomed to, had the habit of doing. So they used to be used, and now this is the past tense of the verb to use, and like the being the past tense of the verb that ends in Z normally, it adds D to make its past form. Used. Used to be used to write with, that sort of thing. So, be careful then to do that one. Now there are one or two other similar developments like that exist in English, but fortunately for you, you could forget them. If you want to, don't bother. For instance, most of us say supposed to in the same way. But if you say supposed to instead of supposed to, then that's perfectly okay. It's not okay to say used to instead of used to. You have to say used to when you mean we're accustomed to. But you don't have to worry about supposed to. But you will hear people saying that. And you'll also hear a lot of people say words like have to, and again, assimilating the V at the end of have to the T at the beginning of to. And what comes out is not have to, but have to. And that's very common indeed. Again, you don't need to. You won't sound wrong, you won't sound artificial if you don't do it. But you'll be in the majority if you do convert it to an F and say have to. And again, there's the word of course, very common little expression, and that very frequently suffers the same sort of process. But again, you don't need to remember it, don't you worry about it. You go on saying the words, aiming to say the words as you normally say them separately, then you'll sound okay. And the last one in that paragraph 5 is the example of has to, often it says has to. It has to. And that is not very important. You can forget it if you want to now. But I can tell you that it does exist because you will hear it. Now we're going to paragraph 6. And now this is not our topic, but it's something you might confuse with our topic. So that's why I mentioned it. The fact is, when you look in the dictionary, you expect to find the current form of a word, or simple word, or compound word, whatever it is. And there are a number of words, particularly compound words, that have gone through the process of assimilation and now have a form they didn't have when they were first formed. That they now take a shape that is slightly different. But it's their permanent shape that everybody uses all the time. So no educated speaker says gooseberry, for instance. What they do say is gooseberry, in English. An American would say gooseberry, perhaps, yeah. But gooseberry, raspberry, in the first line of paragraph 6 now, fivepence, these are getting to be slightly unusual words now, as we don't talk about, we talk about 5p now, it's often as 5 pence. But fivepence, particularly when it's a very common word, regularly converted V to an F. Newspaper, again, it doesn't matter with that, you can go and say newspaper if you like, but you'll find that most people do say newspaper, and rightly most of the dictionaries, the answer dictionary, will show newspaper with an S before the P, being paper. We show it that way because that's the most common word. There are some differences in these words between northern English speakers and southern English speakers. That was paragraph 6 then. So be sure you say gooseberry and raspberry, but don't worry about the other two particularly. Right, paragraph 7. Now here's the most interesting, and to me the most amusing bit of this, and that is that there are some people in the EFL world, quite very large numbers of them in fact, who have a tendency to play the pattern in their own language and make assimilations that the English speaker doesn't make. And I'll give you some examples of those. The people who do that are speakers of Dutch and French, notice contiguous languages, a shared feature across a political border there, the Dutch and French, Greek people, and speakers of various Slavonic and African languages. Now, when they get hold of an expression like backdoor, they tend to want to call it bagdoor, to assimilate the K at the end of back to the following voiced consonant D that begins door. And so here are my example. Following the beginning of door, by turning back into bag, what these people do is they have, in the second word, or second half of the word, they say they have a sharp, voiceless consonant, if you like, and they convert the end sound from a voiced to a voiceless one to match that following voiceless one. So you can see what it's like when you hear people who want to say dreadful, right? Because dread followed by the suffix for, dreadful, don't say dreadful, but dreadful, dreadful. Or instead of saying fog patches, they say fog patches. Sounds very odd. And instead of saying flagpole, they say flagpole. Right? Now, fortunately, not many people are afflicted with that sort of problem. Mostly in Europe, anyway, it's Dutch people are fond of doing that, so I don't know if you've got any here. But that's it, one to notice. And in the English speaking, I warn you against it because it's very uncharacteristic of the English, the whole English-speaking world, right? And most of the remarks I'm making to you now refer to not just to British English, not just to what Professor Wells calls received pronunciation, what I call just general British. It's not to those, I'm talking about the English language in general as spoken throughout the world. And these phenomena are shared by practically all native English speakers. Now there's one group of well-educated speakers that have this tendency to do the thing I'm talking about in section 8 here, and it's speakers in the north of England, in large counties like Yorkshire and other counties around there. In the northern part of England, they tend to do this to a very great extent. In fact, I don't know whether you who were, how many of you are literary experts, but if you studied English literature, you probably at some time heard of J.B. Priestley. J.B. Priestley was a very famous British writer of the middle of the last century, and he came from Bradford, and if you hear him talking about his native city, he calls it Bradford. Bradford. Now, I advise you not to call it Bradford. It may sound very authentic if you're there, but if you're not in Bradford, I call it Bradford. So, that's all I've got to say there. I'll give one other little example, just as a token, if you like. Sometimes people invent other little variations, and one I've heard very often is a speaker wanting to say, I love one, and now the final pronoun one following the verb love has to be said quite quickly, quite smoothly connected to the previous word, because it's a rhythmical unit, love one, and they can't manage to do this because not having a VW contrast in their language, right, then they tend to make the W into a V. So they don't say I'd love one, but I'd love one, I'd love one, or halfway. And that of course sounds quite bizarre to native English speakers, so they might not even understand it. So you have to be careful of that if you have that tendency. Make sure that you do say love one and really articulate the W as a W, not another V. So there's the first topic of these four, and it's relatively minor except for a few particular examples I've pointed out to you. Now we're going on to the main topic of all in this set of four, and that's elision. And elision is simply omission. It's a technical word being used for a long time. See, I note that the Oxford Dictionary has examples of the linguistic use of the term elision dating back to 1581. It's a very long time for a linguistic term to be in circulation. But here it is then. This is removal of a sound, omission of a sound, because the group of consonants is too heavy to say in the time the speaker wishes to allot to it. And remember, speakers are constantly binding together groups of words in order to make their meaning clearer. Because if you speak without fluency, if you halt in between words constantly, then you're not anything like so easy to understand as a person who unites rhythmically the groups of words that belong in their meaning together. So this is what happens then. Elision means that somebody saying an expression omits one or more of the sounds in it. And the examples I've given are, first, I say it with exaggerated accuracy, if you like, but unsuitable for ordinary fluent delivery. Rest breaststroke. Now, I had to slow down in the middle of that word to say that, and it sounded artificial, pronounced breaststroke. Or some people even going to say breaststroke and release that T, breast. And now, if you release the T, it sounds as if you've got a schwa following that, a vowel in that. Anyway, breaststroke. First stop, no T. I wasn't saying a T in first stop, right? Not in at the end of the word first. Masked ball or masked gunman. Hardly anybody said this past tense of the verb to mask, masked, which I would have a T at the end of if I said it on its own. But when another word follows, it's SKT, it's a second, and then another consonant. It's such a heavy group of consonants that we don't like Shakespeare because we don't manage it. It slows us down too much. So masked ball, then masked ball, and I then give you at the bottom of the page a set of common elisions that I've written in a way that acknowledges the existence. They're not normal. These are unorthodox ways of writing these statements, and sometimes these purists, these people who complain about the way other people pronounce their language, are paid to write these things they don't like the sound of, or imagine they don't like the sound of, write them in this unorthodox way. Anyway, I've written good eel, take care, Prime Minister, and extra attention for what, if I slow down enough to say them very clearly, are good deal, take care, Prime Minister, and extra attention. But if I give them that extra attention and slow down that much, I don't sound normal saying. I do sound labored, having difficulty with speaking the language, saying in that way. So don't be afraid to say take care, Prime Minister, and so on. Oh, quite commonly, somebody in the newspaper will say, oh, that television user, he doesn't talk about the Prime Minister, he talks about the Prime Minister. Well, of course he does, because that's what nearly all of us talk about, is the Prime Minister, and we don't manage to have two M's in the middle of that expression. We haven't got the time for it. It's a single unity, that compound noun Prime Minister, and we don't want to slow it down and split it up into two bits that aren't important to separate. So there you are then. That's what happens with that kind of illusion. And then over the page, the second side, I've given an example of a very common word. You needn't indicate. That is, how we pronounce 6:30. 6:30, and even with 6:30 with released T, sounds terrible, really, with a released T. Usually, if you've got a consonant ending one word and another consonant beginning the next, the consonant that ends the first word is not released. You hold the position of the consonant with your tongue, but then you go straight on to the next consonant without inserting any sort of vowel gap in between. So now you needn't bother to try and say 6:30, although you will find it easier if you do, right? 6:30. But 6:30 is okay. 6:30 said fluently like that is all right. But some of these things, for example, I've given you and tried for you, are to make you aware of what we are capable of doing, what people frequently do, so perhaps they won't throw you as much, they won't confuse you if you hear them and you know you can very possibly expect them. Right, paragraph 10 then is now about certain words that usually or very often are rather misrepresented in dictionaries. Particularly if you've got a good dictionary translation like Professor Wells's LPD, Longman Pronunciation Dictionary, or the famous Daniel Jones EPD Dictionary, they're pretty reliable on these words, on the whole, not infallible, but pretty reliable, and they will show you a fairly reasonably realistic version of the way people say them. But these words are very commonly used. Funnily enough, they were learned words that only sort of very well educated people knew at one time, but they quickly get adopted by everybody, by the masses. And in the process of being much used, they tend to get worn down a bit, to get reduced in their total articulation. So nobody now makes 4 syllables of actually. Nobody says actually. Actually, 4 syllables sounds most odd. It sounds like a voice from the past, from hundreds of years ago. So actually, people say actually. That's 3 syllables. Or if you like, actually, that's 2. Right? You can miss out a middle syllable in addition. And again, very few people say generally. If a person says that word in that way, he must be speaking to somebody who's partly deaf, but help him understand. It doesn't sound normal at all. So generally then, you notice with the second vowel of the written form would have disappeared altogether, especially the end of generally. Another example, very common, obviously. Now, obviously can be 4 syllables, but usually it's obviously. And this one, the dictionaries haven't got out yet. Not even Professor Wells' dictionary. He knows about it, but he's too timid to put it in. I acknowledge how people say they have all these purists writing in and complaining so long. The language is going to the dogs. People don't speak English well anymore. Well, that is nonsense. Because the best educated people are the ones who use these constantly, lead in using them, if you like. But anyway, obviously is okay. You can stick with that obviously 4 syllables. But you'll find most people say obviously, which is 3 syllables, and goodness knows what those consonants are. Half the time I don't know what consonants I've uttered there, because I'm in such a hurry to say this word that I blend the B and the V, or I reduce it to one consonant only, which is half a B and half a V. That's goodness knows. But you will get anyway. The thing about this is, why I mention it to you, is that you're prepared to hear these words said as casually as this, right? So obviously, usually, yeah, and I'm amazed how often people imagine that we say usually. That is a mid-Victorian pronunciation. It's been dead for 100 years, that usually with 4 syllables. It's usually with 3, and the middle syllable would be a schwa or a gu, usually, or more often still, usually 2 syllables, usually. All those middle bits left out. And as for the next one, that's wonderfully amusing, because temporarily is, I mean, you need an Olympic medal if you can say that. Whereas they did expect you to say, these purists who write to the newspaper and complain about BBC newsreaders and so on. I remember listening many years ago to a very gifted announcer was announcing a music program on our cultural program, Radio 3, and he said, temporarily, and I gasped with admiration that he'd gone over it, but nobody else did. He was a clever man, an actor and so on, but he was making a misjudgment to bother to say it like that. Most people don't make any difference between temporarily, don't say that, between this word and temporarily. Now, I don't know whether you know temporarily, temporal. Temporal is the word that's the opposite of religious, if you like. So that somebody like the Archbishop of Canterbury, somebody in the church, has to deal with temporal matters and with church matters. Sort of. Anyway, I remember being amused one time hearing a BBC news bulletin in which a not infrequent topic on these news bulletins, there was some poor parson, some poor priest in one of the southern counties who had a not very proper relationship with one of his congregation. A lady, he'd been too close to a lady he wasn't married to, right, in his car. And the announcement said that he had been temporarily relieved of his duties. So, not temporarily could mean that other meaning. It was the word, if you slow down enough, you would have pronounced temporarily, but nobody does slow down that much these days. So, oh, by the way, the last line, the Americans have a good way out of this, and one which we increasingly adopt pretty sensibly, and that is to say temporarily and move the stress, the main stress in the word, later. So it's easier to say and get all the sounds in that the spelling suggests. But it's slightly currently weighted, really. It doesn't matter. Right. So paragraph 11 then deals with this topic I've already been referring to, and that is the release of consonants. You do not take your tongue away from the position of consonant at the end of one word, take it right away, and then put it back for the next. You keep it, if it's, say, a D followed by an N, you keep your tongue in the same position, you just change the rest of the aspect of that consonant. And the examples I've given here are, well, we've already had take care, but I've given postman, windmill, grandfather, at the end of paragraph 11. And if you do release the T at the end of postman, then you sound at least halfway to saying not postman, but postman, postman. And there's no such word as postman that I know of. Window mill, no, there's no such thing as a window mill either. Or grandfather, well. So grandfather. In fact, nobody wanted to release it if you leave the D out. In a sequence of 3 consonants like that. But if you put the D in, don't release it. That's the advice. Now, getting on well with our dealing with this topic of elision. And in paragraph 12, I warn you again about interpretation of the spelling of English words. Unfortunately, the English-speaking peoples are dreadfully traditionalists. They don't like to change, even when it's ridiculous not to change. And I'm afraid our spelling of the English language has not changed seriously for about 400 years. But the language has changed, it's the spelling that remains the same. Hence the difficulty for most people. You know, it really is quite laughable. If you try and mention something called a spelling bee, I don't know if you've ever heard of this game, but it's a game that can only be played by the English-speaking peoples, right? The people in other countries like Spain and Italy and whatever it be, they can't even understand the concept of this. What spelling bee? Because their language is, relatively speaking, spelled as they say it. So that if they know how to say a word, they know how to spell it. But huge numbers of words in English are a difficulty for the learner, the English-speaking, native English-speaking learner in schools. They constantly find, even quite clever and very well-educated people make all sorts of spelling mistakes in English. It's because our spelling is archaic. It represents the way King Alfred said it 1,000 years ago, still, instead of showing how it's pronounced today. So, be on your guard, and I'll give you some examples. And this is a kind of thing you've got to, if you have any suspicion of whether you're saying this word right or not, check with your pronouncing dictionary. That's why a pronouncing dictionary is better than just using the ordinary dictionary. It'll be more reliable, and you'll get finding the facts you want more quickly in it, because you won't be wasting time wading through a lot of grammar and meaning stuff. Anyway, there's a word that looks as if it's blackguard, but nobody for the last 200-300 years has pronounced it blackguard. It's blackguard. The case gone all together, right? Christmas, nobody says the T in Christmas. Not Christmas, is a very odd pronunciation. Christmas cupboard, that's been for 600 years without any P of cup. Or you can see, of course, we preserve the fact that we know it was originally a board, a table, if you like, on which you put cups. It isn't quite that now, but and we go on spelling it that ridiculous way when we're saying cupboard, just to be leaving the P out to be sensible. Even evening, too. I've often had people say to me, good evening. And the only thing they ever say to me, it marks them as completely un-English straight away, un-English speaking, because no English speaker normally says anything but evening, 2 syllables. There's no middle vowel in the word evening. And there are quite a few words like that, so think about the ones that you might have some doubts about and check in the pronouncing dictionary. So, right. Another example here is the word soften. The language is soft. the verb corresponding, don't put the T into that and make it softer. Because I think I've once in my life ever heard any native English speaker say it that way. The normal thing is soft. But funnily enough, this very often used word, often, in fact it's so often used by so many people, with the T in it, that now it's difficult to know which one is the commoner version. And I myself, like so many people, I'm inconsistent. I often say often, and I often say often. Doesn't matter. So, yes, be on your guard against those. The word calm lost its L about 400 years ago, 400 or 500 years ago, and it's creeping back in American English, and occasionally creeps back in British English. Because nowadays it's such a small world that we tend to be influenced by each other, particularly because we, in little old England, are influenced by great big America in some of these things. Particularly when we find that we have to use American reporters on our television news and things like that. People do imitate each other, not for any unworthy reason necessarily, but simply out of politeness. To say a word immediately after another person and say it in a different way can sound very awkward, if possible. And this is one of the ways television newsreaders and radio readers prepare their scripts and think about how they're going to say things. They will often, even though it's not their normal habit, they will adopt the the pronunciation of a word used by the correspondent whose extract they play. Right? When they play a recording of a correspondent, and then they follow or introduce it or follow it, they will adopt, at least for the time being, that person's pronunciation, even if it's a mispronunciation. And a wonderful example of this that I heard, we had a British politician, a very respectable man. He led a minor party for a while, called David Owen, well-educated, public school in South England, and he was on a panel program answering questions about politics and so on, and some other members of the panel were actually in German, so it's an international one. They were Germans speaking English, and one of this lady, she used what we can only regard really as a gross mispronunciation of the word sovereignty. She pronounced it sovereignty, right? And I thought, oh dear, David only had to follow her. And it's going to be very awkward for him when he says that same word just after she said it and say it differently. He's going to perhaps upset her, and she'll suddenly realize that she's been saying it wrongly. And you know what he did? He mispronounced it in her way. That's the way we influence each other. He talked about sovereignty, and I'm sure he'd never done that before in his whole life. So that's how things change. People are too polite to disagree with each other. So, all right. Oh dear. I've got to quickly deal with the many examples here now. Here's some warning expressions. The ch and j at the end of the words cannot be lost, if you like. So, look at my example at the end of paragraph 12. Oh dear. Yeah. This is my alarm clock. So, how much reading to go? Here we go. The examples I'm giving here are don't say H.G. Wells and what change and village church, but say H.G. Wells and watch change and village church. Also, if you want to simplify the word, you want to prove the word month, right? You can pronounce it months if you like, and leave the th out, but you can't say 2 months, 3 months, which I very commonly hear from EFL users because they find it difficult to say an S after a th. But we do too. We leave the th out, we don't leave the S out, right? So keep the S, keep the sign of the plural, and say 2 months. No th at all. That's okay. And finally then, and these are only in for completeness because they're very minor matters, there's compression, which has been dealt with more fully, properly by Professor Wells. I think he's already touched on it. This is where I've only got really one important point to make about that, is that compression sort of thing happens when radio becomes radio, and when following becomes following. What I'm going to recommend to you is that you don't pronounce fireman that way, or powerful that way. But if you, power is fine, fire is fine, but if you don't make a compression and smooth out the our diphthongs before another ending like that, you will sound as if you're speaking over carefully. We don't say fireman, we say fireman. We don't say powerful, we say powerful. In fact, you can powerless, which can come out like this, powerless, which is another word, which is German dictionary as well. Anyway, not a big topic, compression for us. And finally, liaison. Well, we all say the idea. We all put an R in because the R's occur naturally from the ordinary patterns of English in certain situations, and we slip some in by analogy, by imitation of what we do in other circumstances. And I'll just give you a few examples in the very last paragraph. The end of the paragraph 15, I give the typical example idea of it. Most English speakers, not most Americans, about 1/3 of Americans perhaps, but 2/3 of Americans don't. But English speakers who all say these R's in a word like word, pronounced as word and so on, if they have that R there, they don't put it in elsewhere. They're too aware of it. So if you pronounce word without any sound in it, then you're probably in the category of people who say idea of it. And now the examples I give here are, be careful not to sound abnormal. Don't avoid putting the R in our own or else. This is the third line of paragraph 16. Better and better, later on, far off, other end, pair of, and so on. Right? All those normally have an R in, and they sound artificial, they sound awkward if you don't put the R in. So I would strongly recommend you to put the R in. Of course, it's in the spelling, but there are some like that where you still are best advised to put an R in, even though there's not one in the spelling. And now my last example is, again, referring to putting an R in. I give the examples on the last line, but one drawing, and so I saw it. I'm not recommending you to use those after the vowel or, right, but the other ones. And I've given this pleasing example, a kind of joke that lots of British or English-speaking children like to have, is to make up titles of books, mock titles, not real titles, but make up titles of books that have a joke involved in them. And here's one. There is Dog's Delight by Nora Bode. You see Nora Bode can be spelled N-O-R-A, the girl's name, or it can suggest gnaw. You know the word gnaw that has a G at the beginning, which you don't sound, of course. And you see what a dog does with a bone, bite it, gnaw it, or gnaw it, if you like. But you don't have to say gnaw it. Okay, well that's all for today. Thank you very much.